Matthew stood on the sidelines, watching the tryouts for the school boxing team. Just then, the bully appeared, hurling insults and making him the center of ridicule once again. Nick stepped in, standing up for his friend. A fight broke out. The story begins with Matthew, a young man facing one of the toughest challenges, being the new kid at an unfamiliar school, where he knows no one. He is certain that his appearance will make him a target for bullies. His frustration grows even more as he constantly argues with his mother, blaming her for everything. If she hadn't remarried, he wouldn't have had to move here, wouldn't have lost all his friends, all just so she could satisfy herself with her new husband. On his very first day at school, Matthew immediately became the center of attention when he showed up in a formal suit, completely out of place among the casually dressed students. The first person to tease him was Nick, but fortunately, he wasn't mean-spirited. In fact, he even invited Matthew on a tour of the school. Before long, Nick introduced him to Ruby, another friendly classmate. Thanks to them, Matthew quickly felt less out of place and gained 2 new friends. During lunch, Matthew couldn't take his eyes off Teresa, the most beautiful and popular girl in school. Seizing the moment, he bravely approached her to ask her out. But just then, the story's antagonist appeared, Hector, Teresa's boyfriend. Without hesitation, Hector asserted his dominance by punching Matthew to the ground, laughing as he taunted him. Back home, Matthew wrestled with his own frustration, feeling weak, powerless, and an easy target for bullies. Just then, Matthew's stepfather Ray walked in and asked about his first day at school. Matthew gave a short reply, "It was fine," then quickly tried to slip away, hoping to be left alone. However, Ray noticed the boxing posters on Matthew's bedroom wall. Wanting to find common ground to connect with his stepson, he decided to give him a book about Muhammad Ali, the greatest boxing legend of all time. But instead of showing interest, Matthew pretended not to care. He had no desire to bond with his stepfather, let alone build any kind of relationship with him. Before long, Matthew started carrying the book everywhere, hardly letting it out of his sight. One morning at school, Hector, knowing full well that Matthew was too timid to defend himself, decided to push the limits even further. Without warning, he dumped a cup of juice all over Matthew's book and shirt, leaving him humiliated as the crowd erupted in laughter. Just then, an unexpected figure stepped in: Dan, the school janitor. But there was something about him that made it clear he was more than just a janitor. Without saying much, Dan firmly pulled Hector and his friends away, allowing Matthew to go about his day in peace. But that peace didn't last long. During lunch, Hector spotted Matthew watching the tryouts for the school boxing team. Seizing the opportunity, he hurled insults at him, once again making Matthew the target of ridicule. Nick stepped in, ready to defend his friend. But when the consequences came, only Nick and Matthew had to face them. Both were punished, while Hector walked away scot-free. Back home, Matthew could no longer keep everything to himself. He finally confessed to his mom and stepfather about what had been happening. Taking matters into his own hands, he asked his mom for permission to join a gym where he could learn how to defend himself. At first, Matthew's mother strongly opposed the idea. She didn't want her son to become violent or get involved in fights. But Ray understood what it felt like to be pushed around without being able to defend himself, and he convinced her to at least let Matthew give it a try. The next day, as Matthew stepped into the gym, he was immediately overwhelmed. The rapid thuds of fists pounding heavy bags, the lightning-fast punches, and the intense atmosphere of focus made his heart race. The thought of being able to do the same set his eyes ablaze with excitement. Coach Howard stepped forward, scanning the determined faces before announcing that they would soon hold qualifying rounds to decide who would make the official team. At that moment, Matthew spotted Hector and his friend Joy entering the gym. It turned out they were the only ones automatically accepted onto the team, while everyone else had to fight against them to prove their worth. Seeing this, Matthew hesitated. He quietly gathered his things, planning to leave before anyone noticed. But just as he reached the exit, he ran into Dan. Dan told him that if he kept running, fear would always win. Punches only hurt for a moment, but fear will cling to you forever, unless you face it. Dan's words echoed in Matthew's mind. He turned around, stepped back into position, and prepared to face Hector. Hector didn't miss the chance to turn the match into a public humiliation. Hector attacked relentlessly, landing powerful punches on Matthew. Matthew couldn't fight back, he couldn't even throw a single punch. All he could do was endure it, letting himself be beaten down in front of everyone. Finally, Coach Howard stepped in, raising his hand to signal the end of the match. As the crowd dispersed, Matthew was left alone, slumped on the floor, weighed down by disappointment. Dan returned, standing in front of him with his arms crossed. Seeing the disappointment in Matthew's eyes, Dan sat down beside him and began to share his own story. It turned out that he had once been a boxing champion, standing at the peak of his glory until a series of bad decisions sent him tumbling down. Now he had accepted this job as a way to redeem himself. Dan promised to teach Matthew everything he knew and train him after school. In the early days of training, Dan quickly noticed a problem: Matthew ran out of energy too fast. He wasn't overweight, but his stamina had clearly taken a hit. It turned out that Matthew was a leukemia survivor, and years of treatment had affected his physical endurance. For as long as he could remember, Matthew had dreamed of becoming a boxer, but his mother, too worried about his health, had never allowed him to step foot in a gym, put on gloves, or step into the ring. His mother had always hoped that Matthew would become an accountant or a doctor, a safe career with no risk of taking punches in the ring. However, over time, his relentless efforts began to pay off. His stamina improved, his lung capacity increased, and he could now last through an entire round without exhaustion. His speed sharpened, and his punches became more precise. Day by day, Matthew was no longer the weak boy he once was. He was becoming the worthy opponent Hector never saw coming. That afternoon, Hector and his gang once again tried to provoke Matthew, but this time he had no intention of backing down. When Hector challenged him, Matthew accepted without hesitation, and the group headed to the gym to settle it. Hector fought dirty, and his friends jumped in to help. Matthew was knocked to the ground. Just then, Dan appeared, stopping them in their tracks. He warned them that if they continued, he would report everything to the school administration, getting both Hector and Joy expelled for violent behavior. Howard arrived and immediately took the side of his top fighters. Howard emphasized that Dan was just a janitor, a position that could easily be replaced. Moreover, he had known the principal for years, so she would never believe anything Dan said. Instead of arguing, Dan chose a different approach. He pulled Howard aside for a private conversation and made a proposal: let Matthew compete in the upcoming boxing event. If the boy was truly weak, there would be no need to eliminate him. He would fail on his own. But if he had potential, this would be his chance to prove himself. Convinced that there was no real risk of Hector being expelled, Howard agreed to let Matthew participate, but under one condition: he had to bring a signed permission letter from his parents. This was no small obstacle, as Matthew knew his mother would never approve. When Matthew came home with a black eye, his mother was immediately worried. She couldn't believe what her son had been doing after school, and was even more terrified to realize he was stepping into a world of violence, one she had always tried to protect him from. The next day, Dan brought Matthew the news. He was thrilled about the opportunity, but at the same time, he couldn't shake his concern about his mother. He knew she would never allow him to participate in the event, especially now that she fully understood just how dangerous it was. At this moment, Dan told Matthew that he couldn't hide behind his mother forever. If he didn't fight to earn the respect he deserved, he would regret it for the rest of his life. With only a few weeks left until the event, Dan promised to teach Matthew everything he knew. They would train in secret, and when the right time came, Matthew would know exactly what to say to convince his mother. But as the competition day drew closer, Matthew's mother remained firm in her refusal. With no other choice, he decided to forge her signature and submit the registration form. As usual, he went to Dan's workshop to train, but Dan wasn't there. Not wanting to miss a session, Matthew completed all the exercises on his own before heading home. However, the moment he stepped inside, he froze. His principal was sitting with his parents. She had called his mother to confirm her consent, and now, all of his secrets had been exposed. Caught in his deception with no way out, Matthew was forced to confess everything to his parents and the principal. He admitted that he had been bullied from the very first day. Hector and his friends had made his life a living hell. All he wanted was a chance to stand up to them, to earn the respect he deserved. And now, because of a single signature, that one chance had been taken away from him. Matthew then asked the principal about Dan and learned that he had been fired for allegedly inciting violence at school. Upon hearing this, he stormed off in anger, leaving his mother furious at his defiant attitude. But to Matthew, this was his life. He refused to keep living in fear. Determined not to give up, he sought out Dan, who was now living on a boat. Standing before his former mentor, Matthew sincerely apologized for causing trouble and begged Dan to continue training him for the upcoming fight. Dan looked at Matthew and told him that there was nothing more to learn. He had mastered every technique, and now it was time to go back, make amends with his parents, and prepare to face Hector. Hearing those words, Matthew reflected for a moment before heading home with a newfound sense of determination. After days of contemplation, his mother finally made an important decision. She gave him permission to compete in the event. Not only that, but she also promised to be in the stands, supporting him in the most important fight of his life. On the big day, Matthew stepped into the ring to the cheers of his family and friends. Even his father had traveled a long way to be there, witnessing this defining moment. Howard entered the ring and firmly announced the rules. The match would last 3 rounds, each 1 minute long. The winner would be determined by the judges, and the fighters would have 45 seconds to rest between rounds. A bell rang. The match had officially begun. Hector immediately took control, launching a flurry of powerful punches aimed straight at Matthew's head. He could only brace himself in defense, struggling to withstand the relentless onslaught of his opponent throughout the first round. In the second round, Hector landed a precise punch to the liver, sending a searing pain through Matthew's body. He staggered, nearly collapsing, but just then, the bell rang, signaling the end of the round. Dan and his father rushed to his corner to assist him. Kneeling beside Matthew, Dan spoke firmly, reminding him that this was the fleeting pain he had mentioned before, one that would pass. But from this moment on, no one could ever take away his courage. In the final round, flashes of all the times Hector had mocked and bullied him ran through Matthew's mind, fueling the power behind each of his punches. Summoning every ounce of strength, he threw a direct punch that sent Hector crashing to the mat, leaving the crowd in stunned silence. However, before the referee could finish the count, Hector pushed himself up just enough for the fight to continue. In the end, Hector was declared the winner. But in front of everyone, Hector did something unexpected. He extended his hand toward Matthew, a gesture of acknowledgement and peace. Although Hector was declared the winner, Howard called for the entire crowd to applaud Matthew for his courage and resilience. He then announced that Matthew would become the school team's lead fighter, as Hector was set to graduate at the end of the year. The film closes with the image of Matthew rising as the school's new star, a young man who not only earned respect but also proved that sometimes the most important victory isn't measured by the outcome in the ring, but by the courage to stand up and fight for what you believe in.